Now as we get started, I want to mention that a lot of this project is very simple, but pay close attention and take your time with every stage, and be careful with alignment. If you are following along with the patterns, this one is presented a little differently from my previous patterns. You'll have to print the PDF out on tiled pages and tape them together if you plan to use a common household printer. Make sure your pages are in alignment to ensure your pieces line up well during assembly. I suggest laying it all out and taping it together as one big sheet to make sure everything is properly aligned. Starting out, I'll use some general masking tape to tack the pages together. Then when I'm satisfied with the alignment, I'll commence with transparent tape to join the pages together. I normally just use scissors to cut the patterns, but for this video I'm demonstrating an alternate method you may prefer. I'm using a scalpel with a fresh blade on a cutting mat. Note that your patterns may differ slightly from what is shown here, as I've made a few small adjustments for the final pattern version and added some indicators for extra clarity. For this project, I'll be using leather that is approximately 9 ounces, which is somewhere around 3.5 millimeters thick. I suggest using a fine point marker to help maintain accuracy. Using a wide tip marker can throw your dimensions off slightly, and since this piece has several parts that need to line up, it's better to be as precise as you can. You can also transfer the registration marks, which will come in handy for alignment during the assembly stage. When you're done tracing, set the patterns aside, as you'll need to transfer some of the guidelines when the parts are cut out. The first thing to do in cutting out the leather is make broad cuts to separate the pieces. This makes the cutting process a bit easier. It's more difficult to make careful cuts if you're having to move around the whole hide. I'll be using a box cutter and leather shears to cut this out. You can use whatever you're most comfortable with. Again, just take your time with the cuts and make sure they are smooth and clean. Now we need to transfer the guidelines to the leather, which we will reference during the assembly process. First, I wet the leather slightly with a mist of water, and when it has been absorbed a bit, it will now accept an impression. The guidelines you want to trace are the long dashed lines and the solid inner lines. The dotted lines are to indicate the stitch lines, and you don't need to trace those, since you will use a stitching groove or a wing divider to indicate those lines later. To transfer the designs, I just overlay the pattern on the pieces and trace using a ballpoint pen with a firm pressure. It's also possible to cut the pattern along the line and just trace the reference line as well. The next process is skiving the edges of some of the pieces. The purpose of this step is to make the assembly process and wet molding stages a bit easier by providing tabs to connect the pieces together. It is possible to omit this step, but it's more work in the long run. The pieces that are skived are the tops of the wide side panels of the helmet base and 4 of the 6 crest pieces. I call them crest pieces anyway, but it may be more accurate in armoring terms to call them combs. The tool I will be using is called a super skiver and is available from Tandy Leather. You can also use various blades to perform this process, but this tool is a worthy investment. I have a fresh blade and simply pulling along the backside of the edges I want to skive. I'm taking off about half of the thickness of the leather with more of a taper towards the edge, and then make a light pass above that to thin the leather out a bit more. There are a few things that skiving will do for us on this project. First, it'll make the tabs easier to wet mold over. It also makes for a clean and smoother inside of the helmet without a lot of sharp ridges, and it can also allow for nicer transitions, like skiving the end off a piece to make it taper cleanly together. Now we need to glue the crest pieces together. I'll be using EcoFlow leather glue and applying it along the edges of the piece with a small wool dauber. In this example, I'm not doing any extra prep work to improve the binding of the glue, as the stitching will hold everything together. On the side crests, take extra care when lining up the pieces. They are not meant to be symmetrical or lay flat when put together, and they won't line up on their own, so just make sure the pieces join evenly along the edges and use the registration marks as aids. The center pieces are symmetrical, so all you have to do is sandwich them together. Make sure the edges are as flush with each other as possible. I am using some small clamps to keep a little pressure on the parts so they stay together as they dry. To make the crest pieces look clean and smooth, we need to sand the edges slightly. I'll be cheating a bit by using my belt sander to expedite the process. I'm using a worn-out 120 grit belt, but you can use a sanding block or just normal sanding paper to smooth out the edges. This step is purely cosmetic. You'll also want to use a stitching groover with a narrow band around the edge. This is for stitching and decoration. You can also bevel the edges at this time as well. Once the crest pieces are glued together, I'll be sewing them with my heavy-duty sewing machine. I realize that not everyone will have access to a sewing machine, but there are a few other options. You can of course sew this by hand, but I don't have a tutorial for saddle stitching yet. But I'm sure there are some on YouTube if you're not familiar with the process. You could also potentially rivet them along the edge as well. And finally, if you're just using this for cosplay or display purposes, with a little extra additional gluing prep work, you can even be okay with just a good quality contact cement. For the crest pieces, I'm using a number 2 craft tool edge beveler. The wider profile of this beveler will give me a more rounded shape to the edges of the crests. I'll use a size 1 on the rest of the pieces. The next step is folding out the tabs. To assemble the crest pieces to the helmet core, we need to wet form the tabs a bit. This process is made easier thanks to the previous skiving step. All you have to do is stretch out the tabs and finesse the shape a little bit. In my case, I'm using a bone creaser to work out the sharper angle on the tab along the guideline transferred previously. Reforming this tab will make the next assembly step easier. Now the center crest and center panels of the helmet core can be glued. I prefer to glue and sew the center first, because it'll still be easy to access the area with the sewing machine. Once the glue is set for a few minutes and is tacky, I'll start adhering the crest to the helmet core. I will start at the back with a snug fit and press the pieces together. I'm making sure the core tabs line up evenly at the front as well. If the pieces do not line up, you'll need to evaluate the alignment and perhaps pull the pieces apart and reseat the crest. To get a better bond and start working on the cleanness of the overall shape, I'll take the bone creaser and work on the geometry where the pieces pair up. You can slightly mist this area to aid in the workability of the leather as well, and then burnish the edges and really press down the tab into the paired surface to improve the glue bond. Here again, I'll be using my sewing machine to sew the lines around the crest. When the center crest is attached, the process is basically the same as before for the side crests. Just glue along the tab and the inner edges of the helmet core. Here again, I'm working out the shape of the tabs to make sure the fit is tight and the contact is good on both glued pieces for a good bond. You can attach both side crests to the helmet core at this point, but I'm waiting to glue the side panels on so I have better access with my sewing machine at this stage. It's easy to sew yourself into a corner on complex shapes if you're machine stitching. If you're hand stitching, you can pretty much glue it and sew it all in one go if you want. Now the stitching can be done for the side crests. Next, we'll glue up the side panels to the outsides of the side crests, and we'll stitch those the same as the rest. And now we get to the bottom trim pieces that crisscross with the side crest pieces at the front. In my demonstration, I am offsetting the pieces from the back slightly for the sake of fit, but in the final pattern it is adjusted so you should be able to cleanly line up the points of the bottom trim piece to the back center of the helmet, like so. You should definitely do a test fit before committing to the glue up though. If you use a different thickness of leather, or if the cuts weren't precise, or if the pieces got stretched, the dimensions may have shifted. These things can affect the alignment. You'll want to fit the pieces to prioritize the crisscross feature in the front of the helmet. This piece is designed to be trimmed once you are happy with the alignment, which I'll cover more in a moment. Just get some small clamps and play with the positioning until you're happy with the look. Then you can mark it and glue it, and sew the bottom trim pieces. And now I finally get to demonstrate some basic wet molding. It's definitely an underutilized technique for how straightforward it is and how much better it makes things look. The concept is really very simple as well, though it does take a little practice to get right. I'll start by wetting the leather with warm water. The easiest source for this is the shower, so give it a quick bath. But you probably don't want to wait all day, so just do it long enough to get a complete saturation on all surfaces inside and out, but don't drown it. I try to case the leather just enough so that I can put it aside for an hour or so and resume work on it. You'll know the leather is dry enough again to begin forming it because some of the areas will lighten back up and it'll start to feel more firm. If it's soggy and limp, you'll just have to wait a little bit longer. I'll start the forming process by pressing out from the inside with my forming tool of choice. I'll normally stretch out the center areas of the spots I want to get the most depth and shape to, and then blend until the shape looks consistent and natural. The blending process can take place from both the front and the back depending on what is needed for achieving the desired shape. You don't need anything expensive to do it either. Just something firm like a wood handle of something, or in my case, I'm just using my edge slaking tool. I waited until the end to finalize the assembly for the Criss-Cross design feature. This is because the wet molding process can affect the geometry and position of things. If I attached it first, it might very well have ended up lumpy or bowed, but now that it's in its final shape, we can finalize the assembly. So if you're looking at the helmet face on, the right side overlaps the left side from the top and flows under the left side at the bottom. Spend a little bit of time making sure the alignment is where you want it. These pieces are small enough to be easily wet molded into the shape you want if your alignment does seem off. When you're satisfied, you can go ahead and trim some of the excess but leave enough of a tab. To achieve a seamless look, you have to trim the ends independently so the seam is hidden by the overlapping layer. In my case, I decided to rivet the Criss-Cross design even though it is not riveted in the reference. The first rivet I placed was at the higher crossing and hidden under the top layer. And if you want a cleaner look, you might want to just glue the next layers together, but for more stability I went ahead and riveted the top one as well. This is not marked in the pattern because it would be very easy for any shaping or stretching or imperfection throughout the entire design process to throw off the alignment. So you'll have to carefully examine the design and find your center point on the overlap if you want to rivet it as well. The dyeing process will be very simple. I'll be using a black Pro oil dye from Skving's and a piece of high-density sponge to apply a generous coating inside and out. Once the dye is applied and dry, it is best to buff the surface with a rag to remove excess pigment. I'll be using an acrylic finish for the helmet called Satin Sheen. This will provide a protective coating and help seal the leather both from bleeding dye and protection from the elements. Acrylic finishes also help firm up the leather to make it more rigid. Now the trim pieces need to be painted to look metallic. There are more steps that you can use for more realistic results, but this method I will show you is very fast and simple and gets the job done. First, I masked around the trim pieces and gave the trim a base coat of pewter metallic paint. Then I crumpled up a paper towel and lightly blotted for a fine texture using a brighter metallic silver. After letting it dry briefly, I dabbed the texture a bit more and smudged it and buffed it in areas just to vary the texture a bit more. Then I removed the masking tape and clean off any accidental paint marks. Once again, thank you for joining me in this next tutorial. I hope you were able to get something out of it. And if you want to see more tutorials like this, be sure to let me know what you would like to see next, and subscribe to keep up with future tutorials and project builds. You can find Prince Armory on Facebook, Patreon, and Instagram. Hope to see you there.